was last here 5 years ago when we were down at Pace University, and we've wanted him to be back to speak at PDF, and normally in June he takes a family vacation. It's a tradition for him. We got lucky this year. His plans changed, so we were able to get him to come on fairly short notice. But it is really a thrill to welcome Yochai Benkler back to PDF. He's the author of probably the seminal work for many of us, The Wealth of Networks. Highly recommend that you go read it if you haven't read it, because it is to the internet economy what Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations was for thinking about capitalism. He teaches at Harvard Law School. He's the co-director of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, and he's going to talk to us about the SOPA PIPA fight as a case study of how the network public sphere, this new ecosystem that we're living in, how it works and why we need to defend it. Yochai Benkler.
Thanks, Micha, for that incredibly generous introduction. It's great to be back at PDF. What I want to try to do in the next 12 minutes is tell us a story about what happened in SOPA PIPA as we're seeing it fall out of the data in the media cloud and controversy mapper system that we're building in order to try to actually get some data-based analysis of what happened and how it flowed over time. And in that process, also begin to answer some of the questions that Leslie was asking earlier about what the techniques are, what the connections between people are, and perhaps to begin to give us an image of what a future networked public sphere could do to push back on the power of money. So if in the 1990s we had the moment where we believed in a Jeffersonian democracy coming, the Supreme Court wrote about everyone a town crier, everyone a pamphleteer, over the course of the 2000s we saw a series of interventions based on data as best we had it then that suggested that the internet was fragmented, concentrated. You can talk, sure, pamphleteer, but no one will hear you. Polarized and ineffective. The ties were too weak. And yet there's no way that that can explain a lot of our actual experiences, and it certainly cannot explain this unique, or we hope not unique, but special moment in terms of the ability to look at it, of what happened when something moved from 18 months ago on September 20th, 2010, being described by The Hill in the most technical, uninspiring terms. How could you be against it? Leahy and Hatch, co-sponsor, COICA, billions of dollars, thousands of jobs, bipartisan. IP is not a partisan thing, it's something else. 18 months later, people come to Wikipedia and this is what they see. Imagine a world without free knowledge. How did we move from three of the wealthiest, most powerful lobbies in DC supporting a completely bipartisan bill to this and the complete collapse of this piece of legislation? And what do we understand from that about how the network public sphere really works, at least at its most ideal context? And admittedly, this is the most ideal context. And more importantly, from that lesson, what chunks can we begin to identify that we can reuse in future campaigns? So in the first week, all of the initial alarming stories come from tech media. This is all based on over 10,000 stories over the course of the 18 months, based on text and link analysis, size identifying who is most linked to in that week. It's mostly a West Coast media thing. There's a little bit of the Hill story down there. But a week later, several things emerged that remain stable over the course of the next 18 months. Tech Dirt emerges as a major clearinghouse for information. Look for yourself. GovTrack becomes important. The EFF becomes an important source. Demand Progress, and down at the bottom there, being cut off for some reason, we're seeing the computer electronics industry. So Tech Dirt had over 900 stories over this period, multiple links. Interestingly, the most linked to one, this one, ended up being itself subject to a DMCA notice takedown and was unavailable for Google searches for a month in the life imitating life moment. The EFF played both a clearinghouse, but also a place where another thing that began to emerge, which was periodic expert attestation about what's wrong with this. So in this case, early in that week, an open letter from Internet engineers usually would not find its way to any op-ed in the mass media system, has an outlet. Demand Progress, another piece that bumps up that week, starts with the next step of converting to action, the petition that ultimately has 300,000 people. And the consumer electronics industry publishes this letter by more traditional organizations primarily pushing forward. As in the lame duck, as the Senate committee passes this act, you've got See for Yourself, cultural discourse, the GovTrack being very large. You see the EFF, you see CNET. Senator Wyden puts a hold on it in the prior Congress, and what you see here are two things. First of all, to the cat signal, the EFF here raising the alarm, and second, public knowledge raising all of the set of letters. Here's a whole set of letters that was published at the time, and interestingly, you see the rise of the right wing of the blogosphere also emerging. So whether it's Don't Censor the Net coming out of Patrick Ruffini, whether it's Hot Air, whether it's Cato at Liberty, whether it's a bunch of other places, you see the right beginning to say, this is not us. We move on to phase 2 and PIPA. Public knowledge starts to come and take the same role that EFF played in the first time around as information clearinghouse. The tech media continued to play a very large role, and TechNet continues. And Don't Censor the Net moves to add this petition that we also saw from Demand Progress. So again, you see these connections on both sides, connecting how we talk about this, moving from IP to censorship, and combining with action both left and right. The following week, tech media rise very significantly. Here you see, by the way, the only counter. You do see, it's not that there's no information. Back to the point you were making, Alexis, about you can't let anything ride. It's not that there are no efforts to get into the conversation by people who support the act. The AFL-CIO comes out very strongly in favor of it, but there's less amplification because instead of what captures the most audience being out there in the mass media, it's what captures the most emotion and enthusiasm to link to and point to each other and say, this is me, this is how it connects to me. The next week, Senator Wyden puts a hold, and everybody looks at that and points at that and says, that's the act of heroism, but things don't quite go away. Microsoft also there supports the act still at this time. That's another thing that shows up that week. Fascinating in this case is this is a sweet, slow news week. There's almost nothing, which allows for the rise of this. What is here on InfoJustice that suddenly emerges in this week? It's this highly technical analysis of how this particular approach will break DNS-sec. So what it means is that something that couldn't in a million years in the mass-mediated framework get any attention becomes something that people can actually see. And instead of just saying, oh, internet is all bytes, this is very detailed, could never make it in a longer. It's not that the Times doesn't matter at all. There's 1 week in which Times opinion is really important, and they come out against it, and that's important, but it's alongside everything else. The following week is quiet, and then a new phenomenon emerges. Look at what happens in this week where USV, where Union Square Ventures, suddenly blows up as a major item that people are looking, primarily linking to this story of Brad Burnham's, identifying a letter from venture capitalists saying this will break the environment that we want. Again, we're not picking friends from a crowd. We're trying to identify from the data what were the things that people started to pay attention to. We move then to phase 3, to SOPA, and we begin to see the emergence of new voices. Here, what's very powerful in the last week of October is Fight for the Future emerges as a new player. Don't Censor the Internet as very large, and the Screen Actors Guild also tries to get their position across. What Fight for the Future in this case, what had the most links here, was this video which succeeded in combining, again, net native to its own culture, a very arresting video that was also very detailed in its analysis and combined to action. And you're missing the action down here primarily. So it's visually arresting, captivating, but also combined to action. As I said, Skin article to move forward. The next week, the first week in November, Open Congress becomes the location. This becomes a month of trying to figure out what the action is. So Open Congress is the first place that flares up for action. Essentially, analysis of the bill with the ability to vote for and against, close to 3,000 votes against, 27 vote for. But the rest of the time, it looks more or less, once you ignore Open Congress, it looks very similar to what we've seen before. I want you to look at these two slides, this one and the one after it. They're the first half of November and the second half of November, about the beauty of how open and flat discourse really is. We've all heard power laws. It's just 70 blogs. It's just replication of mainstream media. Look at how relatively flat, other than Wikipedia down here. And what happens here, this is not Wikipedia activism. This is Wikipedia as an information source. This is a description of the bills, how very flat it is. People are trying to figure out what's going on and what needs to be done. Now look what happens the next week. It completely changes because from exploration, we see coalescence to action. We see American Censorship Day. That's what basically happens. We see people calling Congress and we move from exploration that's relatively flat to coalescence for action. Now when we look at this at December, let me use a few other identifications at 10 seconds each. The first thing that happens in December overall is pushing back with consumer power on corporate money support. So in the first week, we see Sunlight Foundation over here coming out with publishing Follow the Money list. And down here, what we see is a debate about the position of the Business Software Allowance, the BSA, triggered in part by Kaspersky quitting BSA, in part by other sites. The next week, we see another interesting phenomenon, which is as the manager's amendment comes out, as the open comes out, we begin to see individuals, in this case individual law professors, suddenly becoming very largely connected because they're giving expert opinion. Then we move to 4 weeks later and something completely different happens, which is Reddit and GoDaddy dominate the conversation, including the domains.com and Namecheap. This all comes from the Judiciary Committee trying to push back on the erosion of control, identifying a list of commercial supporters. Then someone on Reddit basically saying, hey, I have to renew my GoDaddy names. I'm moving from GoDaddy. And somebody else editing and saying, we'll give you a coupon to move it here if you're doing it, and tell us that you're doing it for SOPA. It doesn't take long for everyone to point to Reddit. GoDaddyBoycott.com gets set up. TechDirt writes, SOPA supporters learning that pissing off Reddit is a bad idea. And GoDaddy that same afternoon changes its position. We also see democratic deliberation building within Wikipedia. We see 2,000 people responding to Jimmy Wales's request. We see a lot of conversation that ends up in this, which we all know. When we move to January, we see several other things I want to very quickly mention. One, this repeats in various other places. So over here, Joystick, Epic Games, Major League Gaming. This is consumers of gaming arguing with their companies about what their position is, so that the companies are beginning to pull back from SOPA. Media Matters covers the coverage of the media and pushes back. Another fascinating phenomenon is when Cato breaks down this basic meme that has gone through from the first story on the Hill, through op-eds in support, through various other things, where always it's $58 billion. $58 billion of losses because of piracy. And Cato plugs into, and Julian Sanchez plugs into the GAO story and to the original paper. What's interesting here is that Cato doesn't suddenly become huge, but what happens is TechDirt links to it. So you get an attention backbone of someone who's able to do a very deep dive, not enough to get a lot of links and attention, moving up the attention backbone, and then Reddit identifies to Reddit. Week 2, we see reorganization for action with American censorship and with Wikipedia and Reddit really pushing people to work. We see one day on which the White House flips its position. Everybody pays attention there. And on the 18th itself, we see all of these major sources of action, including ProPublica here running a scorecard, becoming the sources of analysis. So on January 18th to January 19th, this is from ProPublica, the flip in ideas. The critical thing to see is the diversity of this. It's not that mainstream media aren't important, but they are alongside individuals with individual blogs, including experts who are coming and talking and rising through an attention backbone. We see tech media. We see the traditional organizations playing the role. And one of the things that's interesting here is that in February, La Quadrature and Michael Geist, as we saw before, take these learnings and move them into ACTA. So there's direct inspiration to ACTA over on the other side of the Atlantic. And perhaps the most interesting is over 36 experimental action sites. People are throwing up special purpose sites. Let's do this, let's do that, and some of them stick. Together, it weaves a tapestry of diverse discourse, both deep and shallow, both distributed and very focused, converting to action together, not one or another dominant player, but a diversity of players of different kinds, each coming up with their own ideas, each experimenting with new moments, and dynamically linking to each other and shaping an attention backbone of a form we've never seen in mass media, and that was able effectively not to be subverted or shut down by those with the money. So thank you to my team, and thank you for